I'm going to be demonstrating no hip carry. The name is short for no rings, no sew, no tie. This carry is essentially a cross between a no sew ring sling without the rings and a knotless version of Robin's hip carry. It's going to be a one shoulder pre-tied poppable carry. Because this is very ring sling like, it would be very good for little babies, but this is also one of my favorites to use with a super short wrap with my 3-year-old because I find it so hard to reach around her to tighten a sliding knot. And this does not have, it's no tie, there are no knots. I'm using a wrap that is 4 sizes smaller than my base size. My base is a 7. This is a size 3. So this is one that I don't particularly measure straight off of the middle marker, but if you want a gauge for where the middle marker should end up, you want it to end up somewhere in the middle of your back. But generally, I start from one end, and you want to fold over from the end about enough so it's going to be over one shoulder. You want the underside to go under that layer and across your back all the way about to your opposite underarm. So about that. It's not an exact science. Basically, the under layer that is pinned underneath the shoulder, the weight of baby is going to create friction there, and that's what keeps this in place. So I'm going to choose which shoulder to put this on. It's going to go on my left shoulder, so that baby's going on my right hip. With a smaller baby, you could do it centered. And the shorter tail that's folded under is going underneath, so it's pinned against my back by the longer tail. I'm going to put this intersection, I'm holding it with my fingers so that eventually I'm going to have to thread a tail through this fold here. So I'm going to hold on to that on top of my shoulder so that I don't lose that. And then I'm going to reach behind me with my right hand and find both of the top rails, both of the long tail and the short one that's folded under, because I want them both together. And keep that as smooth as possible. Bring it under my arm, and then I'm going to gather up the bottom. Here's the bottom rail of the underside tail. I'm going to make sure that's tucked right with the bottom rail of the main long tail. And then I'm going to take this whole thing across my body, and going from my midline toward my shoulder, I'm going to go through the fold. Essentially, the fold is where in a no-sew ring sling, where your rings would be. And instead, I'm just going to pull the fabric through. And at this point, it gets tricky because this fabric likes to twist while you're doing that. So at this point, make sure, it helps if you have different colored rails, but just make sure that you can keep track of which rail is where, that your bottom rail down by your hips and along the bottom of your back is also the bottom or inside rail of the tail after the intersection, and that the top rail coming under your arm is the top or outside rail of the hanging tail. Make sure that the short tail of the shoulder that's folded under is neatly tucked under the diagonal back pass, so that once there's weight on this, it'll keep that in place. Now I want to make sure that this is properly arranged before I pop my baby in. The first thing for me is to make sure the shoulder is arranged. Now, the most important thing is to make sure both layers are fanned out together. So both bottom rails, both the top one and the one that's folded under, are down on my arm, and both top rails are up by my neck. You want to make sure both of them are fanned out together. This top rail of the shoulder should be fairly vertical, coming straight down from my neck towards the ground. The bottom rail should go across my arm and should be a horizontal line through this little intersection, making a straight line with the top rail of the pouch where baby will be. Now, this bottom rail, I want to loosen up just enough to where baby's knees will be. So for a little baby, that might be up here, but for my 3-year-old, I need to loosen this up almost to my hips because of how tall she is. If you're having an issue with the seat being a little too shallow, one trick that I've found is to find a few inches up from the bottom rail and pull that down to where you want the knees to be, and then tighten the very bottom edge a bit to create a deeper seat pre-tied so that this bottom edge is a little tighter than a few inches up. So it's already got a bit of that pouch. Now I am going to loosen the top rail just enough to be able to push it down. And then the last thing, this is a little subjective, is to make sure that any excess width is bunched where you want it. Some people like it bunched on top. I prefer for all of the excess width to be bunched down to my arm and down here, and for not very much to be bunched here. That's just personal preference. And make sure this intersection is starting quite high, because like a ring sling, when you tighten this is going to come down. So I like to start with it, starting with the pouch small enough is going to prevent most of the motion, but you're still going to get a little bit. So I start with it almost touching my collarbone so that it'll come down just a smidge. Okay, now I'm going to put my daughter in. I prefer to load from the top. You can load from the bottom, either way. I reach up through the pouch and guide her legs through, and then let her settle in with it bunched in her knees until her bum sinks a little bit below. So she's already in that nice ergonomic M shape. And then I'm going to find just the top rail up by the intersection. And while I'm using my left hand to keep the bottom bunching in place under her knees, I'm just pulling up enough of the top rail for her to come up to her armpits. For a smaller baby, it would be up to the nape of their neck. I wanted her on my hip, so I put her in the pouch on my hip. If you put baby in centered and then scoot them over to your hip, you're going to slide the intersection down and to your midline, which is going to be uncomfortable. So now most of this is tightened up just fine. I just need to tighten up the top rail a little bit. So I'm going to find that top rail on the hanging tail past the intersection. Now, this is where it differs from tightening a ring sling. Normally with a ring sling, you take this tail and you pull it towards baby. And you'll notice with no hip carry, if you do this, nothing happens, because this intersection has a lot of friction. So basically, you want to pull, lift baby's weight up off of the wrap a little bit and pull out. So I have this on my left shoulder, I'm pulling out to my left. And you're not going to be able to do a lot of strand by strand tightening through that intersection because of how much friction is there, but you can do a little bit. And then once baby is snug, I'm going to give this top rail one last little, there we go. Once it's snug, you want to kind of comb all this slack down to the end of the tail. And you can see it's spread across my back. The shoulder is capped over my shoulder. And right now, for the most part, it looks like a ring sling, except for instead of rings. I have a intersection at my shoulder similar to Robin's hip carry, but this tail hanging down, which in Robin's I would normally tie under baby's bum, I've got nothing to tie it to. But luckily, this is not something you would do while wrapping because it would introduce a little bit of slack, but just to make a point, I'm going to show you, like, it's sliding a little bit, but there's a lot of tension under this intersection, which is why you just need a little bit of a change in direction to keep this tension here. So what I'm going to do is I prefer to twist this just to keep any of my strand by strand tightening in. If you notice any kind of digging, you can skip that step. That's just, I prefer to twist it. And then you're going to tuck it up under baby's bum, under their far knee, for as far as you have wrap. I have a little bit of tail left, so I'm just going to tuck it under the diagonal pass on my back into the bottom rail, spreading it out smooth. And this is actually, I have enough tail that it's almost going all the way up to the shoulder. I'm just going to keep tucking it as much as I can, smoothing it out. So again, that same tension on the shoulder that is keeping this no-sew shoulder from sliding out, this tail pinned underneath, that same tension is helping keep this tail secure. And it's also pinned under her bum. So this is one of those, a lot of times with no-sew carries, no tie carries, knotless finishes, a lot of people tend to think that they're only good for smaller babies because a larger baby wouldn't be able to hold. And honestly, the way they work, the heavier baby is, the more tension is keeping the carry in place. So you don't have to worry about baby getting too heavy for this finish. The only time I can see it being an issue would be if you had a very particularly slippy wrap. And this can be done arms in or arms out, depending on your preference, baby's preference. You can do it on the hip with an older baby, or you can do it centered. Again, if you want to do it on the hip, put baby in on your hip. If you want to do it centered, put baby in centered. If you start them one way, and I try to scoot her centered now, the tightening on my shoulder is a little uneven now. It's digging a little on my neck, and if I did it anymore, this intersection would get a little too high. So it's doable, it's just not as comfortable. It's just putting her in the desired position to start with. And then to get her back out, I simply untuck this tail down here, loosen it up a little bit, and I prefer with a toddler to, while I load from the top, I unload from the bottom. I just untuck the seat while holding her, pull this up over her head, and put her down, and put her down. Thank you. And then you can keep this pre-tied on you for whenever you need to pop baby in and out. I prefer cinching it up all the way and just wearing it like so for whenever I need to pop baby back in. I would just loosen it back up. And that is no hip carry.